guns. Lots of guns.
Americans love their guns, and they aren't just for the holidays, because Division 2 players also love their gun builds. Just search on YouTube now for Division 2 builds and you'll be inundated with thumbnails that claim that they will melt enemies with insane weapon damage. Something I would never do, of course. Anyway, all these weapon damage builds are great until you run into Massive's latest attempt to suck the fun right out of the game. The Requital Modifier that reflects damage dealt to enemies right back at you. And this has resulted in some mild criticism from the gun-toting player base. And to be fair, when this happens, it can be a little frustrating. So in this video I'm going to show you a build that takes no damage from Requital at all. I'm not going to claim that this is a new or unique build. It's not, but it is one that doesn't get enough use. The critical thing with the Requital Modifier is that it only builds up stacks if you shoot the enemy. This doesn't include damage that your skills do to them. So if you are struggling with this modifier, then just use a skill build. Particularly because there is a little secret that makes them into absolute monsters. They will let you clear heroic content with full global directives solo with ease. But first, the build. Seasons 2.0 introduced some buffs and nerfs. I don't get why Massive nerfs skill brand sets. As you saw at the start, weapon damage builds are far more used than skill builds already, so why make them less attractive? The two that hurt the most are Wyvernware, which had its first brand set bonus reduced from 10% skill damage to only 8%, and Empress International, which saw its 3-piece bonus reduced from 10% skill efficiency to 8%. These suck because these are still the two best skill brand sets in the game when you are looking for more damage. So this build uses 3 pieces of Empress International and 1 piece of Wyvernware, all of which are rolled with skill haste and skill damage. I am also using 1 piece of Bellstone Armory because I like the armor regen that is constantly ticking to help address that this is a 6-tier skill build with very little armor. In addition, I'm using the Gunner Specialization for the 10% armor on kill. Couple these with a playstyle that will see you in cover nearly all the time and you will have plenty of survivability. Now, one skill talent that was buffed with Seasons 2.0 was Kinetic Momentum. The skill damage buff on this has been increased from 1% per stack to 1.5%. A nice buff from 15% at max stacks to 22.5% skill damage. So we're using this on our chest piece. For my backpack talent, I've gone with Tech Support, which delivers 25% skill damage for 25 seconds after a skill kill. So it is going to be up from the first kill to the end of any fight. The final piece of armor I'm using is the Exotic Waveform Holster. This buffs weapon damage by 30%, but the way it does it is that it builds up stacks on one of them, keeps them there for 10 seconds before transferring them to the other skill. So you will see damage fluctuating on both skills every 10 seconds. It's still a nice buff though. For weapons, there are really 2 that are great choices. The Exotic Capacitor is a staple of many skill builds due to its talent Capacitance that adds 65% skill damage at max stacks, and also because its weapon damage scales off both weapon damage and skill tiers. But it does mean that you need to be shooting enemies a lot to keep the skill damage buff up, which might not be optimal given your low armor, in which case Test Subject is an option, which delivers a 40% weapon and skill damage buff as long as you shoot an enemy every 5 seconds. Now, before we get into the skills and that little secret I mentioned, there is an alternative build you could use. If your manhood is feeling a little threatened by this build and you want more weapon damage, more guns, more survivability, and just a little less skill damage, then you could use the Memento Backpack, which at full stacks comes with 30% skill efficiency, 30% weapon damage, 3% armor regen, and of course, all 3 cores. Swap out Waveform for a Picaro's holster like this for an extra 10% weapon damage, and keep 3 pieces of Empress International and Wyvernware. Now, you could also use Glass Cannon rather than Kinetic Momentum to buff weapon damage even more, given that you will have more armor and armor regen to tank the extra damage taken. Back to the main build though. For skills, use a striker drone and an assault turret. The striker drone is great at taking aggro off you and for clearing out enemies in cover. The turret is the secret weapon though, and that is because of one of the passive modifiers that came with Seasons 2.0, Peak Engineering, which lets assault and sniper turrets benefit from the amplified damage multipliers in the same way that you do. So at long range, your turret will be dealing 1.8 times damage, taking its single shot damage to over 300,000, which means it can burn down even the toughest enemies in seconds. For your other modifiers, I don't have a strong preference, so use what works for you. This is an old but great build that to this day will let you solo pretty much anything at a heroic difficulty. But if you are still desperate for your guns, then check out this Pestilence build here, because the Pestilence 6 also don't trigger Requital, and so a nice way to burn down those enemies without killing yourself.